Hi, this is Brian and welcome back to Prater, and today we're going to be going over if we're doing a bearing housing change where either we're swapping out bearing housings or if we had to change the internal bearings inside this bearing housing because they're due past the bearing change, because each bearing has a recommended amount of running hours before they do have to be changed. So in this scenario on our M51, if we were going to get started and go ahead and change this bearing housing, before we go ahead and remove it, obviously we always want to make sure that everything is locked out properly, so that way that when we're going and working with things that nothing's going to turn on while we have our hands near running parts. So once everything is locked out properly, the first thing that we'd have to do is take off the belts, which we can simply go ahead and just roll off the pulleys. Once we were to get the belts off, we got to go ahead and take this pulley off by simply removing these 3 bolts. Once we get that pulley off, we'll be able to get the bushing that's inside of it off as well too. Once those 2 pieces come off, next thing to make it a little bit easier is we go ahead and we can remove the guard. The guard is simply bolted on here and then also here in the back and another one here on the side. Each model is going to have a different amount of bolts per the guard that's on there, but just to make sure you can get these off here and maybe loosen the one that's on the end here, so then that way that allows you to pivot it off the bearing housing, make it a little bit easier once we get this all loosened up, that we're going to go ahead and pick this up and get it off of the body. You don't want to be fighting with the guard. Once we got that pulley off, once we got that guard kind of off a little bit, next thing we do is we're going to go ahead and start unloosening the bolts that are holding the bearing housing onto the body. Now before we go ahead and get to that point, we might want to get some rigging or straps or something that's going to be able to hold the weight of this bearing housing while we're going in and loosening off the bolts that are holding it to the body, because at no point do we want that body to ever come off or loosen while we're trying to loosen and cause a little bit of problem while we're trying to take it off the body. So once we have it properly secured or tightened, or if you have somebody that's working with you give you a hand, we can go ahead and remove all the bolts that are holding the body. Some of them, if you could come pan in here, you'll see that we have a jack out hole, and that's specifically so that once we get all these loose and off, we could take one of the same bolts and put it in that hole and then tighten that into the body, and that's going to help push that off the bearing housing off the body a little bit to kind of get it started for you. Because while this is on over time, and depending on the atmosphere where the room is at, things can get in between or just get sticky or whatnot, and it could be a kind of a problem. It won't necessarily want to come off initially after loosening it. So if you see that they are jack out holes on all our bearing housings, that will give you that tool so that you can properly pop that off of the body and not be fighting with it. Once we get all those loose, we're able to get that off. We'd simply be able to get it onto a pallet or a table, wherever we're going to be doing our work. Now we do offer the option to some customers that buy new equipment to have a spare bearing housing assembly that's already on site. And having a spare on site meaning that we already ran it in our facility, broke it in, so that way when you have to go ahead and change your bearings, it's just simply taking the old one off and putting the new one on. The old one will come off, be sent back to Prater so that we can thoroughly inspect it, take it apart, QC it, and then rebuild it and actually run it in at our facility, because each bearing size does have a certain amount of break-in time for it being a brand new bearing. Can take up for 24 to 36 hours. It all depends on the bearing and the manufacturer, but we do go through that process for you guys prior to you buying it, so then that way you don't have to do that on site. It's just basically plug and play. Once you get the equipment, it's ready to go.